And here we are, friends. You have come to the right place. If you have been horrified, confused by events taking place in Los Angeles, you have come to exactly the right spot. We're going to have not just one, but two great minds to discuss the legal implications, the political implications, how the law meets the politics, and what is going on. You have probably heard about the National Guard being, quote, federalized and deployed to Los Angeles. We're going to talk about what that means, whether Trump is entitled to do that, and what the reaction is going to be. So we're going to let a few more friends join us, and we will try to remind people what we're up to as we go along. But by way of introduction, I will give you Adam Classfeld, who, Adam, I am remiss in forgetting the name of your Substack. What is it?
All Rise News.
All right, All Rise News. And Mary McCord almost needs no introduction. She is at Georgetown Law, and she is the executive director for the, I'm going to try to get it right, the Institute for Constitutional Advocacy and Protection. How about that?
Yeah.
Close enough. Close enough. All right. Well, good. Well, we already have 663 people on board. So let us begin. On Friday, Trump deployed ICE agents to undertake 6 or 7 raids in Los Angeles. This is the new look of ICE. So they're masked, they're heavily armed. They're not necessarily tracking down criminals. They're going to Home Depots. They're going to places of business. At that point, there were conflicts between the ICE officers and individuals. And frankly, much of this, if not all of it, was initiated by these individuals. And at one point, we have video of an ICE official grabbing the SEIU president, David Horta, and really throwing him to the ground. He was injured. He went to the hospital, and he has been held. At this point, we don't even know what the charges are. At that point, Friday into Saturday, Trump said he was federalizing the National Guard. What does that mean, Mary? And does this mean the Insurrection Act has been activated, or is there something else that he's using?
So he has not invoked the Insurrection Act. That's done through a presidential proclamation that usually echoes the predicates for the Insurrection Act that are contained in that statute passed by Congress. An important point of why does any of that matter? The Insurrection Act is an exception to the law that says our military and National Guard, when they are federalized, may not engage in domestic law enforcement. It's actually a crime to engage in domestic law enforcement. And by that, I mean your things you think of that the police do: search, seizure, arrest, detention. So Insurrection Act is an exception to that, but that's not what he used. He used a provision of Title 10 of the U.S. Code, which is the title that applies to our military, Title 10, Section 12406. And it is a section that reads kind of like the Insurrection Act, but it's not the Insurrection Act. It purports to give the president authority whenever, and I'm reading it from over here, there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. And in that case, it allows the president to call into federal service members of the National Guard of any state in such numbers as he considers necessary to repel the rebellion. And so what he did is he cited that statute in his proclamation, and he echoed the words from that statute. So he said that to the extent that protests or acts of violence are directly inhibiting the execution of the laws, meaning, of course, immigration laws, because ICE was there to make ICE arrests, they constitute a form of rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States. Now, there's some things that are remarkable about this because one, just the facts on the ground don't necessarily support that this is a rebellion. And certainly nothing in our history would support using this authority this way. So never in history has 12406 been used to deploy the National Guard federalize the National Guard and deploy them over the government's objection without an Insurrection Act declaration, at least for domestic law enforcement. So one thing that is clear from this order, well, I shouldn't say clear. one thing this order purports to do is saying it's just authorizing the National Guard to provide protection of federal law enforcement, like the ICE agents, protection of their federal functions, and protection of federal property. So it doesn't say they can engage in classic law enforcement. So I think we're likely to hear the administration say this is not a violation of Posse Comitatus Act. It's not something we need to have the Insurrection Act declaration to do. We can just do this under the president's inherent constitutional authority plus this statute to have National Guard engage in this type of protection of federal interests.
Let me stop you just there for a minute. Understand, folks, that we have not had thousands of arrests or hundreds of arrests. We're talking about a few dozen. We're talking about small little pockets in which violence has broken out between protesters and the ICE agents. So this is in no sense an invasion. This is in no sense a rebellion. And in point of fact, they were executing the laws of the United States. They did take people in. And in fact, we've heard reports now that a couple hundred people are being detained in the federal building, awaiting further processing. So the notion that somehow the United States government was paralyzed is nonsense. Now, Mary, there is also language in there that is extremely troubling because it does not say, I am deploying them to Los Angeles or even California. What does it say in terms of the deployment?
Yeah, there's no mention that. So even if an Insurrection Act is used, it's always very specific, right? So think 1992, when there were the riots after Rodney King had been beaten and the officers were acquitted. That was the governor requested it. The president sent sent troops, actually, military troops under the Insurrection Act, specifically to Los Angeles for that purpose. This proclamation has no geographical or time limitation. It simply says that he is directing the federalization of members of the National Guard, that means could be of any of the 50 states, to protect federal property and the federal function at locations where protests against these functions are occurring or are likely to occur based on the current threat assessments and planned operations. So things in the future that we don't even know whether they look anything like a rebellion, he's saying he's authorizing it. I also just saw a clip of an interview of the president on television saying, we're going to have the National Guard everywhere. That is what he was saying.
And this, folks, is utterly unprincipled, unprecedented. Remember that the governor of California did not ask for this. And the last time we had this kind of use of the National Guard was in the civil rights era. If you remember, when mobs formed around schools, preventing the Supreme Court's order on desegregation from being enacted.
And even there, Jen, just to be clear,
yes,
that was with an invocation of the Insurrection Act, right? Then specifically to those places like, Little Rock, Arkansas, and things like that, right? It was never like, those are the only times it's ever been invoked over the objection of the governor.
Adam, tell us a little bit about what the mayor is saying, what the governor is saying, and what, if anything, the governor might do about this as you are seeing this play out in real time.
Well, there's a very interesting thing in the statute that Mary just read out. Orders for these purposes shall be issued through the governors of the states. And so shall, when you hear the word shall in a statute, that is a must. There is no wiggle room there. We've heard Governor Newsom saying that this isn't something that was presented to him that he authorized. He is against this. This is Trump bigfooting in the situation. I want to take a step back here and really talk about the context about what has been happening over the past couple of weeks. Trump probably, as we all know, has been a little stung by the taco situation. Trump always chickens out. Now, he was talking about on tariff. Now, Trump backed down in two major ways recently in the Kilmar Abrego Garcia case. Kilmar Abrego Garcia was someone who was, in the words of Kristi Noem, will never return. Well, now he's returned, and they've dressed it up in the terms of this indictment. They have definitely changed the conversation because a couple of days before the return of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, there was a return of OCG, a asylum seeker who was fearing anti-gay persecution in Guatemala, was literally hiding out and had a very heartrending declaration filed in federal court about it. And they had begrudgingly, belatedly followed the federal judge's order to bring him home. So what we're seeing is the collapse of a lot of Trump's immigration policy. And what does Trump do when he is shown to be much weaker than he pretends to be? He tries to project this spectacle of strength. It's a reason why we are having the No Kings protests commensurate with a military parade all across the country next week. The fact that he has not invoked the Insurrection Act is showing one of the practical effects of it, as Steve Vladeck pointed out in a must-read post recently, is that they are not authorized to conduct law enforcement activities. So he's having the spectacle of these military actors on the streets of LA.
Mary, there is this weird language about it. The order shall be taken through the governor. What does that mean? This is a case where, of course, the president has federalized the Guard. So what does this have to do with the governor? And by refusing to do anything, could Newsom stop this?
So, this statute, that particular term has never been interpreted by a court. But that type of terminology certainly is very much like terminology in other statutes that implies that it requires the consent, right? It actually requires the governor to transmit the order. Now, there could be arguments that the president is actually exercising plenary authority here, and he's got the authority to do this, like outside of 12406, like just under the Constitution. And the Office of Legal Counsel, that is the sort of legal advisory shop within the Department of Justice, back in 1971, did opine that the federalized National Guard could be used for, and the military also, for the protection of federal functions and federal property, right, without an Insurrection Act invocation and just under the president's inherent authority. So there could be that argument, but this statute is the statute he says he's using. And this statute says an order issued through the governor. So if the governor refused to issue that order, and I know Governor Newsom has said, this is not necessarily, he's against it. President Trump is taking over the California National Guard, but I don't know if he has said, I refused to issue that order. And if he did, how is it that those National Guardsmen are on the streets in LA?
What are they doing? Adam, I see pictures on TV of them kind of like standing around, and every once in a while, Maxine Waters, the congresswoman from that era, comes along and kind of hollers at them and tells them they shouldn't be there and they have to follow the law. What are they actually doing there? Is this performative for Trump? Is he trying to goad and bait people into attacking the National Guard?
Right now, it's a very good question, Jen, because that's the inherent danger in that when you escalate things, when you have the National Guard on the street, ostensibly because Trump has not invoked the Insurrection Act, they are not supposed to engage in law enforcement activity. But if things escalate, will they look for an excuse? And that's the real danger of this. And that's, as you said, the performative nature of this. Governor Newsom, as Mary said, calling this unnecessary because it is unnecessary. That once you have that situation, it creates the possibility, even if the military is supposed to be there just to support local law enforcement, protect the federal property, protect ICE, even if that is their kind of very well-defined mission, it creates a possibility of escalation.
Absolutely.
And that's a danger here.
Absolutely. Mary, the governor has made a bunch of tweets. He hasn't even had a press conference. He hasn't, done anything more than social media. Could he sue? What are the other steps he might take to get these people out of there?
Yeah. I personally, I'm a litigator, right? That's what I do. I think that there are grounds to sue here. I don't know if that's strategically the best course. And I assume that he is assessing sort of, do I want to do something like that? Do I want to consider that? Do we really want to wait and see if this just ends up being a 24-hour thing? They stand around, they leave. Trump says he got a big win, but it all just kind of diffuses without escalating. I
Right.
assume he's thinking. I'm not. I don't want to put words in his mouth because I don't know. I have been surprised it's only been social media and no other statement from the governor. Because I mean, we're talking about Trump taking over his National Guard
Yes.
to police First Amendment protected activity. Now, maybe there have been individual acts of violence, but we haven't even had anything that resembles, like an unlawful assembly where the violence is so prevalent that the entire thing can be shut down. And I think, what really should alarm people is by this proclamation not being limited to anything actually happening today in California, but being prospective, this is about U.S. military and federalized National Guard being deterred from their actual missions, their actual jobs, the actual protection of our public safety and our national security to police First Amendment activity. That should be alarming to every American, regardless of your politics. That's where I think we really need to be talking about. I think it is important that it's 1 week before the No Kings Act protest, because what is this? A lead up to,
Exactly.
a military in our streets. So
Exactly. And folks, we're talking about the federalization of the National Guard by Donald Trump, deployed, at least for now, to Los Angeles. But as we've discussed, the order is so open ended, it could be deployed anywhere in the United States where there is even the future possibility of a rebellion. Who knows what that means? And we have seen that at this stage, he has not activated the Insurrection Act. And by the way, folks, just to emphasize, the First Amendment applies. The Fourth Amendment applies. The Fifth Amendment applies. So if they are going in without warrants into people's businesses or homes, that is a problem. If they're interrupting lawful, peaceful protests, that's a First Amendment violation. Adam, do you think that this is a direct attempt to suppress turnout for next Saturday, for No King's Day, and in particular to intimidate Black and brown people who, frankly, have already shown some hesitancy to turn out because of this kind of overbroad, super aggressive, super militarized use of ICE?
Well, to go to your second question first, it seems very significant that the center of these protests, we talk about it being in Los Angeles, they're in Paramount, a Latino community. So to your second question, yes, that is an element here. About No King's Day, a really interesting facet about this. I recently interviewed Ezra Levin of Indivisible for All Rise News, and one of the points of the protests that he pointed out is that it's happening everywhere but downtown Washington, D.C. So it's widely dispersed. There's no center of gravity. And so when you have this big open-ended proclamation about his free roving ability to conduct federalization of the National Guard, it's hard not to look at it through that prism. It will be very interesting to see whether there is litigation over this. And because, covering all of these cases, a lot of these immigration cases, what has Trump been losing a lot of cases regarding? The Alien Enemies Act, where there was also courts rejecting that there is any sort of rebellion. And they were talking about alleged gang activity. That wasn't a rebellion. Then how is protest against immigration policy? It will be very interesting to see if this heads into the courts. And of course, if it does, we'll be on it.
And one of the issues, Mary, of course, and this would eventually go up to the Supreme Court to be certain, is whether this is, quote, a political question, whether it's up to the president to decide if there's a rebellion, if the inability to execute the laws, or it's the court's job to decide this. Talk to us a little bit about that specific issue. can Trump just say, I get to decide when there's a rebellion. I get to decide when there's an invasion. I get to decide when I can't execute the laws. Or is the statute perhaps more limiting on that and gives the courts the opportunity to say, no, we need to determine whether you've operated in good or bad faith here?
So I think you've raised a couple of things there. One of the things that I think is the Alien Enemies Act cases, including it's the one case AARP that it's gone up to the Supreme Court twice now, or been in the Supreme Court through 2 rulings now. What the court has made clear is that even though there is deference to the president when it comes to national security matters, foreign diplomacy matters, even deciding whether sort of some of the prerequisites to that act have occurred, the Supreme Court made clear courts have the job of interpreting the statute, how the statute applies, and whether it's constitutional. So if we take that into looking at 12406, I think that there would be a good argument that it's not a political question if, let's say, the governor or the state were to sue on the grounds that the National Guard had been improperly federalized, that the president exceeded his authority, exceeded the authority that Congress gave to him, delegated to him in 12406 by doing it in these circumstances. I think the court could say, I have the authority as a judge, an Article 3 judge, to determine if this statute 12406 allows for this type of invocation, particularly also without the consent of the governor, as we've been talking about.
Exactly.
Even if you get to the issues of, who decides what a rebellion is? Because there is some precedent, old precedent under the Insurrection Act that the president has pretty much unfettered authority to determine what an insurrection is, or an invasion, or a rebellion. Now, I said that's 1800s law there, but there is also some precedent that would suggest that it could be attacked if it's not made in good faith, right? That assumes good faith on the part of the president. And so that's why the things you were pointing out, Jen, about whether the facts on the ground really match up with what's being said in the proclamation. And I know there have been some individual acts of violence, but we're talking about a situation where law enforcement has control, like you said. People have been arrested. There's no mobs that are running amok, and that law enforcement hasn't lost control. The National Guard that have been deployed are just standing there, right? So this is not anything that actually looks like a rebellion. And so I think there's an argument that this is bad faith, that the courts can actually entertain that litigation. But these are untested and uncharted, arguments. And
Absolutely. This is not a statute that has been heavily litigated because we haven't had a president who has resorted to this sort of overkill and militarization. Now, folks, we're talking about, of course, the federalization of the National Guard, now deployed to Los Angeles, but frankly, in a very open-ended order, Trump could frankly deploy them anywhere in the United States. We're talking about the unprecedented nature, the overkill, the attempt to really stoke the fires and to perhaps provoke an incident that would justify invoking the Insurrection Act. Adam, where is Congress? I haven't heard from any of the Democratic lawmakers, and those Republicans who are out on TV seem to think it was a swell idea to have the military enforcing our immigration laws on our own soil. What's Congress's role in all of this?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Jen. It seems like Congress has been asleep on many things, and this is the latest thing. Well, there is a kind of accepted wisdom about the politics of this. There's the received wisdom is that Trump is popular on immigration. That's his mandate. And so a lot of people might just think that might feel cowed to speak up on it, even in the Democratic Party. And one of the interesting thing is if you look at the polling and you look at the really radical power grabs, people do believe that habeas corpus should not be thrown out like the baby with the bathwater.
Right.
People do, when they drill into the real radical power grabs, it's a much more complicated picture than the 49% plurality by which Trump won the last election means that every abuse of power has to be ratified and can't be opposed. And I think people might be calling their representatives and
Yes, look
giving
at
and not only Republican representatives to say, hey, where are you on this? This isn't even if folks support strong immigration enforcement. I bet there are a lot of people who don't think it should look like this.
yeah, exactly. And good old Pete Hegseth, who is the Secretary of Defense, made an outrageous statement, even for him this week, saying that he was going to, we could have the Marines on the ground, enforcing the immigration laws. This is nuttiness. But how could this escalate, Mary? Are we looking at a situation? We have a president who wants to escalate, a Secretary of State who has no experience whatsoever, and things kind of snowball and get out of hand. What's the kind of framework for trying to contain this?
Yeah. Well, I will just say the statute that the president invoked in his proclamation doesn't apply to the armed services. So it is not about the Marines in to do this kind of domestic protection of federal functions. Again, the president might argue inherent authority, and maybe that's what Pete Hegseth is talking about. I doubt it, because I doubt Pete Hegseth really knows his way around all of these authorities. I don't know that for sure, but I'd be surprised. Legally, I think it's dubious. It would require an Insurrection Act, a proclamation, at least if they were going to engage in domestic law enforcement. And that's what it's unclear. Like, is this gonna roll over into that? And so legally, of course, there's all kinds of questions, but just as a matter, again, back to the heart of this, right? Really, our Marines, we're going to distract them from their job to go police protests, right? That are largely nonviolent. And so, if anything's going to outrage Americans, honestly, it should be this. Can we have our military do their jobs as the military, what all of us expect them to be doing?
Exactly. They are not trained to do this work, folks. They are not trained in law enforcement. They're trained in warfare. And although Trump may consider Americans to be the enemy, these people are not. They are not engaged in law enforcement as part of their normal duties. They aren't. They don't practice de-escalation. Military folks escalate. They don't de-escalate. And that right there is a formula for disaster. Mary, as we reach the end of our time, I want to ask you, there are more protests planned for tomorrow. SEIU is going to have some. There'll be some in D.C. and other cities. Faith leaders are getting together. What should people remember when they are out there peacefully protesting? What should they do and what should they not do?
Well, these questions are so hard for me, because I can tell you the normal world and the way the laws apply, and then the world we're in right now, and will the law actually be applied the way it's supposed to be? But here's what I say. Be peaceful. Do not give any reason to law enforcement or the National Guard to think that you're being violent or not peaceful. And remember, you do have rights. You may be able to, some people may get arrested at things, but you do have those rights. I know lawyers that are going to be, standing by with respect to these things, but don't do anything that would give fodder to the arguments that this kind of overreaching excess is necessary because of a rebellion or an insurrection. I mean, people have a First Amendment right to protest, and they should be protesting. The other thing I would say is we are seeing very aggressive use of the assaulting or obstructing law enforcement statute. This is what Representative McIver was charged with federal crimes relating to the incident outside the Delaney Detention Center in New Jersey. A whole bunch of people pushing and shoving. She ends up getting charged federally with obstructing and assaulting law enforcement. So we know also that the president of SEIU or an SEIU chapter was also arrested. We haven't seen those charges yet, but from what I've seen the administration say about them, I'm guessing that those are probably also going to be the charges. So be very careful if you're in a situation that gets crowded and there's any pushing. If you, just to protect yourself and your rights, stay away from activities that could be perceived that you are obstructing the officers from doing their jobs, right? Like barricading their way so that they can't get to whatever it is that they're trying to do. Those are the things that the administration is relying on to say this is preventing the enforcement of U.S. laws. This is a rebellion, and I think that's what's being considered with respect to the SIU president. Although I think obviously his attorneys and everybody in him, and he would don't believe that's the case at all. But just to protect yourself, know that that's something they're using very, very aggressively.
Adam, if our viewers, our listeners, our readers are having an out-of-body experience because they remember an actual rebellion, an actual insurrection where people attacked police officers, where they attacked federal property, wasn't it the president's job at that point to call out the National Guard in Washington, D.C. on January 6th? The hypocrisy here seems to have broken the hypocrisy meter, if there is such a thing. We've gone from Trump not pulling out the National Guard and pardoning those people who assaulted police officers to him taking if you lay a finger on one of these guys, we're going to lock you up. And I'm going to put out the National Guard when they're not needed. What is going on in this upside down world?
Well, it's this kind of funhouse mirror version of government enforcement. It's interesting that you mentioned the January 6th docket. I remember looking at I followed those hundreds of cases very closely. And in the charging papers, you would see the frames of the assaults on law enforcement. And with the charging papers against Representative MacIver, it's an interesting thing. They used a similar statute, if not the same statute, and tried to draw a parallel with those still frames where something totally different was happening. She was caught up in a melee. So it's trying to muddy the waters, mix things up. And to Mary's point earlier, there are real security threats. And this is what the military, this is what the security services are focusing on right now. To something that happened just this week. It didn't get a lot of attention, but there was a case of a Columbia University student, Yonseo Chung, and the government wasn't able to find her. They tried to arrest her for First Amendment activity, protest, and for deportation. But they couldn't find her. And so the judge offered a way out and said, you could serve her attorneys who are sitting at this table,
right,
bringing this habeas suit. It could initiate the case, and that would be a way through. No, the government responded, we would prefer to hold out for an arrest. Well, the judge prevented that, blocked her arrest anyway. They didn't get what they wanted, which was this spectacle of an unnecessary arrest. But think of the diversion of resources. Yeah. What does that mean for our national security that ICE's priorities are find a perfect GPA Columbia student somewhere in Virginia or New York, rather than address actual national security threats? That when you have DHS being run, according to ProPublica's bombshell story, by an intern just out of college, Thomas Fugate, if folks in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party don't think that opposing draconian immigration enforcement is a winning issue, how about national security? How about the unnecessary expenditure of resources and military personnel and security enforcement personnel on Trump's ego? Is that a winning political issue? I would wonder whether folks can find the courage to speak up on it in that sense.
Absolutely. I want to thank Mary and Adam for coming on with no notice on a Sunday afternoon when they had like a life, unlike me. And for explaining this, this is such an important issue, folks. And we're so glad you join us when we have these moments. On Friday night, we were on with Steve Vladeck to explain the latest on Obrego Garcia. There's breaking news here. You know, you can come here. You're going to get the smartest people like Mary, like Adam. We'll break it down for you. We'll explain it to you. And it will be less intimidating, less scary for you, because I know you'll look at the papers now, you'll look at the news, and you think, oh my God, everything is out of control. And in a sense, it is. But you have agency. Our governors have agency to do things. Our lawmakers have agency to do these things. And you, as a citizen, peacefully protesting, can take this and make this an issue. So thank you both. Again, unprecedented, radical expansion of federal power. None of the predicates were there for Trump to do this, and a potential wide open order that might allow him to put one of these squadrons of National Guard in your state, really when no emergency exists whatsoever. So thank you very much. We'll have more on this tomorrow. And again, thank you, Mary and Adam, for joining us. Take care.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye-bye.